I think it's always interesting to know how books got written, and most of the time in the writing of books, it's sort of a mystery. We just don't know the book. We might know it was written in a short space of time or a long space of time, but the circumstances in which the book appeared and was composed is often a mysterious one. But in the case of this book, number 8, Frankenstein, by Mary Shelley, we know exactly how it happened and the circumstances because of all the people involved in it. And first of all, we have to go back to 1816, which was a terrible summer. There'd been a massive explosion in what is now Indonesia, and the weather that year was abysmal. It rained and rained and rained. And for one bunch of holidaymakers on the shores of Lake Geneva, they were living in a villa. The summer was a complete washout. They couldn't go for walks, they couldn't go swimming, they couldn't leave. They were trapped indoors for day after day, and obviously going a bit stir crazy. So in this villa, on the shores of Lake Geneva, is the person who's renting the villa, the poet Lord George Byron, who was one of the great bestsellers of the time, hugely famous, scandalous, celebrated, whatever you want to say. He was a very, very big deal. With him was his guest, another romantic poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Percy Bysshe Shelley's girlfriend, later his wife, Mary, who was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, the writer of The Rights of Women. And it was a very tense situation because not only was the weather dreadful and they were trapped indoors, but Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley, I'll call her Mary Shelley because that's how she ends up, because she marries Shelley, has just miscarried with their child. So she's very distraught, frankly. And Byron one night says that they're sitting by the fireside in the middle of the summer. They've lit a fire and they're reading German ghost stories to each other to pass the time. Because the rain is pouring down outside and they've got to pass the time. And they're reading these ghost stories. And Byron says, as a challenge to his friend Shelley and the girlfriend Mary, and to himself, why don't we have a competition where each one of us writes a tale of the macabre, a horror story of a kind? And the making of Frankenstein is interesting because all involved in it all gave their accounts. They've all given us a version of what happened. Shelley typically takes a lot of the credit for it. Mary Shelley says that she went back to her room and sort of had a mild freak out. She couldn't imagine coming up with a story that would be the equal of the kind of imagination that Lord Byron would have, or her partner Percy Bysshe Shelley had. So she's worrying. And at the same time, she is recovering from this miscarriage, and also mixed into all this is that they're having discussions about whether you can reconstitute the human frame artificially. You know, they're sitting by the fire, having the kind of conversations you have late at night, and they're talking about whether you can make another man out of body parts. So it's quite whimsical, but quite kind of gothic, and the mood of the whole thing is quite gothic, I think. Mary Shelley goes back to bed, and she has a dream, and she dreams the Frankenstein story. Now, people think of Frankenstein in terms of the monster, but actually, if you read the book, which is some way different from most cinematic versions, Frankenstein is the name of the protagonist, and he's a student. He's not the monster. He's the student who creates the monster, and he is a medical student who is living in Geneva, and he is trawling through the charnel houses, the mortuaries of Geneva, looking for body parts to create a better human being. And Mary Shelley has this dream where she imagines this, and she describes in the dream the scientist who's galvanizing life from human bones. I saw, she writes, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student, that's the student Frankenstein, of unhallowed arts, kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. You could say this is the beginning not only of horror and the macabre, but also of science fiction. There's an aspect of the Frankenstein story which is a prototype of much later science fiction, and it inspires people like Stevenson with Jekyll and Hyde. It's a very influential book. The book itself was published 2 years later, got mixed reviews, but once it got to the readership, it was very popular, and it sold well. People like Walter Scott admired it greatly, and sold well. It was made into a play, and there's something archetypal about it. The idea of making another human being from bits of body parts is quite appealing. And the idea of a scientist, this is very modern, I think. The idea of a scientist losing control of his or her creation is also very appealing. And the idea that we in the world can't cope with the things that we create through science is a modern idea. And so it becomes a kind of metaphor for man's relationship to the scientific world. And it's never been out of print, and when it was discovered by the movie makers in the early 20th century, it became a staple of, and the figure of Frankenstein is a major figure in our imaginations. Although interestingly, the real Frankenstein is not the monster, but the man who created him.